Hello again. On today's episode, we will cover one of Finland's most shocking true crime case, where 3 teenagers were killed while camping in the woods by a lake. You might have heard about this case before, as it's well known all over the world, but I have researched it well and added a lot of twists and information that often isn't included. This is the Lake Bodom murders. But please, as always, comment down below where you are from and what time it is right now. Let's get to it. 4 teenagers set up camp by a quiet Finnish lake in the summer of 1960. By morning, 3 were brutally murdered and 1 was barely alive. The killer attacked from outside the tent, stabbing blindly through the canvas. But here's the chilling part. Despite decades of investigation, no one has ever been convicted, but some of the suspects are very suspicious. What really happened on the shores of Lake Bodom, and why do investigators believe early mistakes doomed the case before it even began? It was June 1960, the start of summer in Finland, a time when schools let out and teenagers looked forward to freedom outdoors. 4 friends, all teenagers themselves, chose Lake Bodom as their destination for a weekend camping trip. They were Seppo Boisman and his girlfriend Mila Emily Björklund, along with Nils Gustafsson and his girlfriend Anja Mäki. The 2 young couples carried with them the light-hearted sense of adventure that comes with being young, away from parents and rules, preparing for a night under the open sky. Setting up camp beside the calm water, they saw only a peaceful retreat waiting for them. The spot they picked lay on the lake's southern shore, a secluded place surrounded by trees and reeds. It was far enough from houses or towns to feel private, yet still not so remote that it was unreachable. They borrowed a light-coloured canvas tent, simple enough to pitch quickly, and arranged their few belongings inside. Sleeping bags, a couple of personal items, and food for the weekend filled their space. To anyone passing by, it would have appeared to be just another group of teenagers spending one of those long northern summer nights outdoors. For them, there was little reason to think that the hours before sunrise would become Finland's most infamous unsolved crime. Nils and Anja had been a couple for some time, while Seppo and Mila were also considered steady. They paired naturally as 2 close friends dating 2 close friends, which added to the easy atmosphere around their camping trip. That weekend promised both privacy and companionship. Sitting near the water, they likely joked, shared stories, and enjoyed the air as the evening grew quiet. The sun in Finland during June sets late, leaving a dim twilight that lingers long. They prepared for sleep in their tent, at a time when darkness never becomes fully heavy. To them it was safe. An ordinary summer night spent like many others. The natural surroundings played a cruel trick by hiding what would soon take place. Birds and insects hummed, the surface of the lake reflected the sky in calm ripples, and the tent stood firm against a light breeze. Everything about the scene signaled peace. To understand the tragedy of Lake Bodom, one must first picture that setting exactly as it appeared before dawn. 4 teenagers, 2 couples, asleep inside their tent, only a few yards from the water. At that moment, their existence could have been written in any summer diary. Friends together, partners sharing closeness, safety assumed. Nothing gave warning of violence. What came next stripped away that sense of innocence. At some point between 4 and 6 in the morning, the camp transformed into a place of terror. While the details of the attack remain subject to mystery, what is clear is that by daylight, 3 of the friends lay dead. Their tent had been ripped open, the canvas slashed by a sharp object from the outside. The 4th, Nils Gustafsson, had been left alive, but badly injured. Nothing of the earlier joy remained. The very ordinary start to that trip made the sudden brutality almost impossible for Finns at the time to comprehend. Part of what made the murders so shocking was this juxtaposition. On one side, the visual of camping, something families and teenagers did every summer without fear. On the other side, a violent end so abrupt that it turned that same setting into a permanent scar. The scene at Lake Bodom became marked not by beauty but by association with horror. Even for those who never set foot at the lake, the imagery was stunning. A tent sitting in idyllic nature, once promising laughter, now shredded and surrounded by death. The disconnect between those 2 images is why the killings etched so deeply into national memory. By 6 that morning, the outcome was already fixed. 3 of the campers had lost their lives. Seppo Boisman, Mila Björklund, and Anja Mäki never left the waterside alive. Their tent, once a temporary home for a holiday, became the object through which an unidentified attacker forced a violent entry without ever going inside. Gustafsson was outside the tent when discovered, badly beaten, with injuries that would take a long time to heal. It blurred the line between victim and sole witness, raising questions that would never fully be answered. The quiet of dawn that day became the starting point for decades of speculation. People tried to imagine what might have happened inside those hours of darkness and early grey light. Why, in a place so calm, had strangers or perhaps someone they knew chosen to attack? Why from outside the tent, rather than face them directly? How had the ordinary fabric walls that were supposed to protect them been turned into a weapon's target? These questions carried weight because the killings did not appear to have motive, at least none that investigators could settle. Looking back, the ordinariness of the trip is one of the hardest parts to confront. There was no lure, no deliberate meeting arranged with a stranger, no warnings ignored. It started with camping, something straightforward, innocent, and typical of youth during summer. This innocence is precisely what makes the story resonate over 60 years later. Parents could see their own teenagers in that position. Adults who remembered camping as children thought of nights they too had spent in tents near lakes or forests. To picture such a weekend turning into an unsolved multiple murder left an imprint on the Finnish psyche. From that point on, the Lake Bodom murders became a symbol of the inexplicable. The summer night, the teenagers in their tent, the soundless interval before chaos, all create the aura of mystery. By the time authorities were alerted later in the morning, 3 lives were irrevocably ended, and 1 had barely survived. The details of that turning point, however, have never been fully settled. The weekend that should have been remembered by friends as a youthful adventure now stands as the most haunting unsolved case in Finland's history. The canvas tent, lying torn open, became an emblem of violence carried out in secret, and the fact that only 1 teenager survived made the case even harder to unravel. Decades of theories only return to those morning hours, which remain the gap at the center of it all. What exactly happened before sunrise at Lake Bodom is still unclear, an unanswered question that continues to shadow the story. In the hours between 4 and 6 in the morning, while the lake remained silent and the earliest daylight began to spread across the water, something violent and unexplainable happened to the 4 teenagers asleep inside their tent. Investigators would later study what evidence they could, but the only thing certain was that the attack began from outside. The killer did not open the tent in a conventional way, nor did anyone walk inside and corner the friends where they slept. Instead, whoever stood outside chose to slash straight through the thin canvas walls with a sharp blade and strike into the darkness, blindly hitting the bodies pressed close together inside. That choice, to stay outside, hidden, yet pierce inward again and again, remains one of the strangest features of the case even today. The method of attack was chaotic and brutal. The teenagers were stabbed multiple times through the fabric, though some blows seemed to come from a blunt object rather than only a knife. That means the assailant carried at least 2 weapons, or improvised one during the violence, which suggests planning or disturbing resourcefulness. Inside the tent, panic must have erupted as the blade tore into the walls, each strike threatening without warning, but the attacker never once stepped inside, leaving the victims partly shielded by their own shelter, yet exposed in a way that offered almost no chance of defense. The tent served as a thin barrier that became the surface for wounds delivered from outside, strange in both method and intent. The choice not to enter has been the focus of speculation for decades. If the attacker wished for control or confrontation, stepping inside would have guaranteed it. Instead, blind stabbing left more to chance. To some, it suggests the person did not want to face the teenagers directly. Others believe it may have been about speed, a way to keep surprise on their side, not risking being overpowered. Whatever the reasoning, it made the crime even more random, more terrifying. This was not a careful or efficient murder, but an act filled with force and unpredictability. Physical evidence later showed varying types of trauma on the victims. In addition to stab wounds, there were marks that showed blunt force impact to the head and face. That means the attack was not only about knives thrust through fabric, but also about heavy blows delivered during the chaos. Those strikes were enough to leave 1 victim outside the tent severely injured but alive. Nils Gustafsson, the single survivor, carried injuries that included a broken jaw, deep bruising, and a concussion. His condition reflected a direct beating, as well as possible struggle, though when or how he ended up outside the tent is a matter that remains unresolved. Nils was found lying on top of the tent the next morning, his shoes missing, his clothes bloodied, his face swollen with fractures. This has led to one of the most chilling uncertainties of the case. Did the attacker drag him out in order to beat him separately, or did he somehow fight his way outside in the middle of panic? If he was forced out, why was he left alive? If he escaped, how did he survive while his 3 close friends died within feet of him? Questions like these have no clear answer because no one besides Nils could give detail from inside those violent minutes. and he claimed not to remember what happened. In terms of timeline, what matters is that everything occurred quickly. In less than 2 hours before 6 in the morning, a tent ripped open, 3 dead, 1 immobile but breathing, and a killer who never exposed themselves. When neighbors and fishermen moved through the lake later that day, no one had seen footprints leading away or a figure near the shoreline. Whoever carried out the attack disappeared silently during those early hours before discovery. The decision to stab through the canvas has led experts to call the method impulsive, yet hauntingly deliberate. The killer did not need to touch the tent flaps. They did not step into the confined space or risk contact with 4 young bodies who might have fought back. Instead, each plunge into the cloth became unpredictable for the victims inside, forcing them into helplessness as blows came from unseen angles. It was violence both distant and intimate, leaving endless speculation about motive. Did it suggest cowardice, or was it a tactic designed to avoid leaving clear trace? The brutality left behind was undeniable. Myla Björklund suffered the worst of the wounds, suggesting either the attacker fixated on her or she happened to be in the most vulnerable position when the stabbing began. Seppo Boisman and Anja Mecki also died from penetrating and blunt injuries. No survivor could describe the sequence of attack. No neighbors heard anything that could establish a solid timeline. For a summer campground in Finland, where nights are unusually short, the silence of dawn was broken, not by screams heard from a distance, but by the haunting realization, hours later, that an entire group had been destroyed in isolation. For Nils, survival carried its own consequences. His condition at the time was critical, with severe bleeding, skull trauma, and facial fractures. Medical staff later confirmed that he bore signs of heavy impact, consistent with a rock or heavy object. If that is the case, it adds another question. The killer used at least one weapon never found, possibly improvised from the surrounding area. That choice links back to theories about opportunism and whether the attack came from someone familiar with the lakeside terrain. By the time the incident ended, 3 teenagers were motionless, 1 fought for life, and the person responsible had already vanished. The lake returned to stillness, the water reflecting morning light, as if nothing had disturbed it. Hours would pass before anyone stumbling nearby realized that a camp had been turned into a massacre. Yet the style of the assault, keeping a barrier between killer and victim, striking with both knife and blunt object, pulling or leaving Nils outside, became central to understanding the case in years that followed. The attack itself formed its own mystery, aside from who committed it. It is that question of method that lingers. Why outside the tent instead of in? Why strike so many times, yet leave one person breathing? Why combine sharp and blunt force with such randomness? The structure of the attack tells us as much about what may have happened as any evidence left behind, because it points to fear, rage, or confusion guiding the killer's hand. These uncertainties shaped how the public thought about suspects, how investigators tested their theories, and how future generations tried to picture events at Lake Bodom. That style, the blind assault through thin fabric, remains one of the enduring puzzles of Finland's most famous unsolved crime. It isolates this case from others, giving it a unique and chilling identity even 60 years later. But if the killings themselves were strange, the aftermath proved even harder to comprehend, because once the bodies were discovered, the true damage to the investigation did not come from the killer disappearing into the landscape before dawn. It came from what happened when the crime scene was first seen and handled after sunrise. Around 11 in the morning, a local carpenter named Esko Johansson noticed something near the shoreline that drew his attention. The quiet camp he approached looked wrong. The tent collapsed in an unnatural way, and movement was absent. When he moved closer, he realized he was looking at bodies. What had been a peaceful campsite hours before was now a horrifying scene, with 3 teenagers lying dead and a 4th horribly injured. Esko quickly notified authorities, believing they would arrive, take control of the area, and begin piecing together what had happened. In truth, that morning set the case on a course no one could reverse. The damage came not from what the killer left behind, but from how the crime scene was handled in the critical first hours. When police first arrived at Lake Bodom, the procedures that later became standard were not followed. Instead of limiting access to the area, multiple officers, civilians, and eventually soldiers moved freely through the camp. People stood on top of grass, flattened by footprints. They touched belongings that should have been documented. The tent, already torn by the attack, was lifted and repositioned before any photographs recorded its original condition. Each of those actions erased timelines and patterns investigators would later wish for. Forensic science was still in its early stages, but even at the time, securing a crime scene mattered. At Lake Bodom, that basic step did not happen. The atmosphere quickly turned into confusion. Civilians who had gathered nearby joined the crowd with little restriction. Some came out of curiosity, others to help, but all their presence added to the contamination. Journalists who heard about the murders arrived, taking notes, describing details, and in some cases moving items to get a better view. Soldiers were called to assist, and though their intention was to help, they ended up making the situation worse. Sent to search the area surrounding the campsite, they walked over potential evidence, trampled paths, and scattered any signs of movement. Close to the tent, items that may have been left in a particular way by the attacker were pushed aside. Footprints, drag marks, or other small traces became nearly impossible to separate from the crowd that swarmed the shore. At the camp itself, possessions lay in disarray. What investigators might have read as evidence of struggle and searched for meaning, instead blurred with the disorder caused by many hands. Food items, clothing, and shoes were shifted around. The thin canvas tent had already collapsed, and handling by officials changed the way it rested on the ground, making later interpretations of the crime scene less reliable. Detectives could not recreate exactly how the teenagers had been left when the killer walked away, because too much had changed in just a few hours of human interference. Each decision to move an object or walk across the dirt seemed small in the moment, but when combined, they destroyed the integrity of the scene. Today, even beginner officers in training learn the importance of establishing a perimeter and recording a crime scene before walking around it. They use tape or barriers, they control who enters, and they document in detail. At Lake Bodom, none of this happened. The realities of policing in 1960 were different, slower, and far less dependent on forensic precision. But looking back, experts often argue that the case could have been solved had that campsite been preserved in its original state. The early mistakes created a problem that technology later in the century could not fix. No photographs exist that clearly show the site without tampering. The earliest images were taken after people had already shifted objects, which meant that investigators trying to review them later could trust little about what they showed. Important questions went unanswered. Where exactly were the victims when the killer finished? What order did the attacks follow? Was Niels Gustafsson dragged out, or did he move himself in chaos? Physical evidence at the scene should have held answers, but answers require accuracy, and accuracy was lost in the confusion. Police realized soon after the fact that order had collapsed. Statements later acknowledged that the crime scene may have been irreparably compromised. That admission highlights just how damaging those hours were. Instead of approaching the scene with careful steps, officials treated it loosely, and each added footprint or careless movement removed another chance of solving the murders. Even simple things like removing and storing items should have been done systematically. Instead, objects were collected unevenly, some without clear notes, and the result was a patchwork collection impossible to place back into context. The use of soldiers showed an eagerness to bring manpower, but also ignorance of procedure. Rather than creating a controlled search grid, they wandered through wooded areas and across shoreline, flattening grass and disturbing soil. If there had been signs of where the murderer exited, how they moved, or what direction they took, those clues vanished under the boots of dozens of men. The surrounding terrain, which might have preserved an escape route, provided nothing useful once it was disturbed. Investigators, who later tried to reconstruct movements, knew they were working with a scene altered beyond recognition. Footprint evidence was one of the major losses. In cases where suspects are later interrogated, matching shoe prints at the scene can support or disprove stories. At Lake Bodom, overlapping prints created confusion. Some may have belonged to the survivors, some to the killers, some to rescuers, and some to curious onlookers. After so many visitors walked across the site, separating any of those groups became impossible. The distinction between vital evidence and background noise dissolved. Forensic advancements in footwear analysis that emerged decades later never had complete prints to work with, making that line of investigation useless. Personal possessions also suffered from mishandling. Bags, clothing, and wallets were lifted and moved. Some later disappeared entirely, leaving the question of whether they were taken by the killer during the attack or lost to handling after. That lack of clarity blurred the difference between crime and contamination. Had the camp been blocked off, inventory taken carefully, and each item logged in its original place, investigators might have mapped motive from what was missing. Instead, they faced guesswork. Each object's story was cut short. The cost was not only practical but also psychological. Families of the victims later learned that mistakes in handling the scene destroyed their chance at closure. For surviving relatives, knowing that answers could have been available but were erased created frustration that lasted decades. For Niels Gustafsson, it meant growing up with suspicion directed at him, partly because the evidence needed to exonerate others clearly was gone. Those early uncontrolled hours left him both a survivor and an uncertain figure in the investigation, a position he would carry for most of his adult life. By the time investigators tried to re-enter the crime scene with more careful methods, it was too late. The ground had been trampled, the tent was no longer in its original condition, and the trail out of the camp was destroyed. What could have been clear evidence became nothing more than fragments misaligned with one another. Modern forensic science, had it been applied to an intact scene, might have traced DNA, preserved footprints, or documented sequence of attack. But with contamination, even the most advanced laboratories decades later struggled to provide answers. In the end, authorities admitted that what should have been a preserved record of the murders was instead a scene ruined by human presence. The first hours, meant to protect evidence, guaranteed its loss. The most valuable source of information, the untouched condition of the camp, was gone almost immediately, and investigators worked from that handicap for the rest of the case. This chaos around the discovery of the bodies meant the crimes did not only involve the violence of the early morning. The aftermath layered another tragedy, the erasure of truth through mishandling. That confusion would soon deepen even further when police realized that essential items, including the murder weapons themselves, were missing entirely from the landscape around Lake Bodom. What makes a crime more unsettling, the violence itself, or the knowledge that the very tools used to carry it out vanished without a trace? At Lake Bodom, the answer often depends on who you ask. The murders were marked by both stabbing and blunt force injuries, which told investigators early on that more than one weapon had been used. Yet, when the area was searched, neither the knife nor the blunt object was found. Police organized extensive sweeps of the shoreline and the nearby woods. Soldiers were even brought in to widen the search grids, combing through undergrowth and waterlogged areas, but hour after hour turned up nothing. It was as if the weapons had dissolved into the landscape, or were carried off deliberately by the killer. For investigators at the time, the missing items became one of their earliest frustrations. Homicide cases usually turn on physical evidence, the trace left on a weapon, fingerprints on a handle, or at least the pattern of blood that can link one victim's injury to a specific tool. At Lake Bodom, the absence of such evidence cut short countless possibilities. Without a knife or club to examine, they could not confirm angles of entry or cross-check wounds with a blade's dimensions. They could not test the theories that developed about whether one or two attackers had been involved. Instead, they were left with bodies showing trauma and a campsite in disarray, but with no instruments that tied the actions together. In addition to the weapons, other personal items disappeared from the camp. Reports later showed that wallets, pieces of clothing, and some personal belongings no longer matched the inventory families knew the teenagers had brought. This detail went beyond curiosity. Each missing item could have shaped motive theories. If money was taken, it leaned toward robbery. If clothing was removed, some believed it hinted at humiliation or a more personal motive. But with the crime scene already disturbed by outsiders and the lack of records about who touched what, police could not tell whether a killer had stolen specific objects or whether they were simply lost in the confusion after discovery. One of the most disturbing individual details came from the condition of Myla Ermeli Björklund's body. Later examinations suggested that she suffered wounds not only before death but also after it. That distinction carries significance because it may point to rage or fixation on her in particular. While all three victims in the tent had severe injuries, her case was marked by post-mortem attack. To many, this indicated an emotional or personal element behind the killer's actions. Yet without the weapons themselves, investigators had no way of determining whether the same knife was used throughout, or if one was used specifically on her, separating her ordeal from the others. That gap in understanding pushed theories in directions that never reached certainty. Even the seemingly small detail of shoes added to the mystery. Nils Gustafsson's shoes, unlike his other clothing, were missing from the immediate crime scene. They were later found hundreds of meters away from the tent, far enough to raise questions about how they got there. If Nils had crawled or staggered that distance before collapsing, he would have left more signs of movement, which were never described. If someone else carried them away, it suggested either an attempt to mislead or a ritualistic act. The shoes turned from ordinary belongings into part of the puzzle, one more object whose placement contradicted easy explanation. Each missing item deepened uncertainty over what kind of crime had taken place. Was it an attack motivated by personal anger, a robbery that escalated, or an act of random violence? That answer often depends on how one interprets the absence of things. Without weapons, the idea of random violence feels harder to maintain, since someone deliberately removed the very tools police needed. Without wallets or clothing, robbery appears possible. Yet the ferocity of the attack far exceeded what seemed necessary for theft. Without clear reasons for why Nils's shoes travelled so far from the tent, theories of staging or intentional confusion gained traction. The relentless searches conducted in the days after the murders carried into the lake itself. Divers explored the water close to shore under the idea that the killer might have thrown the weapons in to hide them quickly. The bottom of Lake Bodom was combed, yet nothing resembling the needed tools surfaced. Police considered whether the killer left the area by boat, carrying the weapons along, but no witnesses reported activity on the water that morning. Dogs were used to trace scents, yet by then too many people had disturbed the land. That failure left investigators with an outcome worse than finding nothing at all, since it left them with endless speculation about what could have been if precise searching or preservation was done earlier. Over time, the absence was magnified by comparison to what could have happened, with evidence in hand. If the knife or blunt weapon existed in police storage, decades later, scientists could have tested them for DNA. If these tools had been preserved, even the smallest trace of hair, fibers, or blood outside of the victims might have pointed toward suspects. Instead, when suspects eventually appeared in investigations, the lack of material evidence meant police could never tie them conclusively to the scene. The missing weapons transformed every accusation into a question rather than an answer. This absence also became a central part of the cultural shadow around the murders. People wondered if the weapons were still lying somewhere close by, waiting to be stumbled upon by a hiker or fisherman. Rumors spread that they were hidden in houses, buried in forests, or still submerged in the muddy floor of the lake. None of these ideas produced anything reliable. Authorities followed tips for years that promised discovery of a knife or heavy object linked to Lake Bodom, but each search closed without result. The search for weapons became its own ongoing narrative, almost like a ghost story tied to the landscape. The missing objects introduced ambiguity that shaped every theory about the crime. If the killer was identified, how could prosecutors prove it without the very instruments of murder? If suspects confessed, investigators could not match their stories to the tools. If locals suspected a neighbor, absence of weapons meant suspicion, stayed speculation. Each missing item was a void that pulled argument and belief into it. The fact that police could not present one piece of undeniable physical evidence made the entire case unstable. Decades later, that elusive absence still defines the crime. The knife and blunt weapon have never been unearthed, and the items gone from the camp never reappeared. Every retelling of the story includes the reminder that the weapons remain unfound, as central to the mystery as the murders themselves. Without them, tying any one person to the crime lacked the force of proof. The Lake Bodom murders remain unsolved in part because the violence is inseparable from the silence of lost evidence, and when suspects did come into view, their stories were rarely built on clear forensic links. More often, they were propelled by rumor, reputation, or coincidence, rather than the hard certainty of objects that investigators never recovered. Carl Valdemar Gillstrom was not an outsider or stranger to Lake Bodom. He lived nearby and ran a small kiosk in Oitar. To the community, he was a familiar face, though one remembered more for hostility than warmth. For years before the murders, locals knew him as quick to anger, especially toward young people camping in the area. He earned a reputation for chasing teenagers away from fields, and rumors suggested his behavior went further than shouting. People said he threw stones, cut down tents, and intimidated anyone who entered what he considered his territory. The kiosk gave him constant proximity to campers and earned him grudging recognition. By 1960, he was already described as a man best avoided. After the murders, his name surfaced almost immediately in whispers. For many in the community, suspicion was an easy leap. A man with a documented history of harassing campers lived practically in the shadow of the crime scene. He had a pattern of threatening those who pitched tents nearby, and now 3 teenagers had been killed in a tent only a short walk from his kiosk. Neighbors did not imagine a faceless stranger. They looked to him first. Stories spread that his aggression extended beyond daytime outbursts. Those who drank with him or knew him more closely later claimed he sometimes muttered drunken confessions about the killings. Whether those statements were real, exaggerated, or fueled by gossip remains unclear. But in a place where he was already feared, few pressed for answers. Some even claimed to have seen him returning from the lakeside the morning of the murders, though at the time, intimidation kept them from speaking to police. Fear silenced witnesses, leaving rumors to grow unchecked. Suspicion only deepened in 1969. 9 years after the murders, Gillstrom walked into Lake Bodom and drowned himself. His suicide, in the same lake where the teenagers had died, felt, to many, less like coincidence and more like confession. People said he had given himself away, admitting guilt through the act of dying in the waters tied to the crime. In reality, he left no note and no explanation. Still, from that moment, his name and the murders were inseparably linked. Up until his death, he had one strong protection: an alibi from his wife. At the time of the murders in 1960, she told police that he had been home asleep and not near the lake during the early morning hours. Her statement shielded him from further interrogation. With no physical evidence available, her testimony mattered. Investigators could not place him at the scene, and her word was enough to turn attention elsewhere. But years later, after his suicide, she admitted that her alibi had been false. She confessed she had lied because she feared him, and that he had threatened to kill her if she told police the truth. That revelation erased the foundation of his defense and reignited speculation. Even so, decades after the murders, no physical proof tied him to the scene. Police had failed to collect the kind of evidence that might have carried weight years later. DNA testing, once available, offered no new leads because the items that might have preserved traces were lost or contaminated long before. The weapons had never been found. Circumstantial suspicion was all that remained. Adding to rumors, neighbors recalled odd incidents that hinted at concealment. After the murders, Gyllström filled a well on his property with concrete, a move many considered suspicious. For years, people whispered that the missing weapons had been hidden there, sealed away forever. Police did search parts of his land, but found nothing to confirm the story. No knife, no blunt weapon surfaced. The theory persisted anyway. It fit the image of a hostile man who wanted to close off his property and may have needed to hide something too dangerous to leave in the open. Over time, his reputation shifted from living suspect to enduring legend. In books about the case, including one published in 2006, authors highlighted him as the most likely murderer, arguing that police had missed their chance to prove his guilt. This framing kept his name alive in the public imagination more than any other suspect. Although never formally charged, he carried the weight of community judgment. Stories of his temper, his drunken mutterings, his threats, and his suicide gave people a figure to blame when official answers failed. His death made him unforgettable. A kiosk owner, notorious for harassment, drowned himself in the same waters tied to the country's most infamous unsolved murders. The detail created a narrative too striking to ignore, a man ending his life in the shadow of the crime he was believed to have committed. Each retelling of the murders included his name, whether in family conversations, official reports, or media accounts. His suicide became the ultimate fuel for folklore, leaving future generations to wonder what he had taken with him to the grave. Police maintained that lack of evidence prevented them from naming him as the killer. Without proof, suspicion was not enough for a conviction. But for the public, proof was unnecessary. In their eyes, his bitterness, reputation, threats at home, drunken words, and suicide combined into a picture too complete to dismiss. Gyllström became remembered as the likely murderer, whether or not that was true. In this way, he transformed from suspect into ghost story. Parents warned their children about men like him. Locals spoke of his temper as if it explained everything. Writers and broadcasters used his name as shorthand for menace. The deeper truth, that nothing had ever been proven, mattered less than the story he came to represent. He remained ever present, feared in life and mythologized in death. Though suspicion never left him, the absence of evidence meant the Lake Bodom murders remained unsolved. Carl Valdemar Gyllström became less a case for police and more a story retold by the public. He was a man remembered not for guilt proven in court, but for guilt written into legend. But there was another man whose life eventually pulled him into the circle of suspicion. Unlike Gyllström, it was not his temper or hostility that made him notorious, but a very different kind of scandal. On the morning of June 6, 1960, just one day after the murders at Lake Bodom, a man named Hans Assmann walked into the Helsinki Surgical Hospital. He claimed to feel unwell, but what stood out immediately were his clothes. They were stained and spotted, the kind of marks that caught attention, given what had happened only hours before. Dirt covered his fingernails, and his behavior was described as nervous, even aggressive at times. For the staff who saw him, this was not just another patient with a mild complaint. Under the cloud of the killings that had shocked Finland, he looked like someone who needed much more scrutiny. The hospital staff recognized the stains as blood. They also noted how shaken he appeared, his agitation not matching someone with a simple medical issue. His appearance alone, a mess of mud and blood on a morning when police across the country were searching for a murderer, should have triggered protocol. Yet the step that mattered most never came. Police failed to collect his clothes for analysis. The garments were not taken as evidence. With that mistake, investigators lost a possible direct link between a suspicious man and the crime scene. It remains one of the most significant oversights in the long story of the Lake Bodom investigation. In the Cold War setting of the early 1960s, rumours spread quickly and carried weight. Asman was not unknown in Finland. Some believed he had a background that reached beyond ordinary life, with whispers connecting him to the KGB. Stories circulated that he had ties to intelligence work, feeding the idea that perhaps he was trained in secrecy, travel, or even killing. The mix of his strange hospital visit, the bloodstains, and these supposed links turned him into a figure people looked at with more than casual suspicion. No one knew for certain what his history included, but speculation thrived in the vacuum left by missing evidence. Then came another detail that deepened suspicion among a public already desperate for answers. Witnesses who believed they had seen a figure near the murder site described someone tall, fair-haired, and possibly foreign-looking. Soon after these details appeared in newspapers, Hans Assmann cut his hair. Before the reports, it had been long and blonde. Afterward, suddenly it was cropped short. To many, it seemed like an obvious attempt to alter his appearance once descriptions became public. The timing made his reputation align too closely with the shadow of Lake Bodom to ignore. Police, however, never charged him. With no collected clothing and no usable forensic links, they had nothing to connect him directly to the victims. The missed chance to test his garments meant all that remained were suspicions built on coincidence. His behavior, his haircut, his supposed intelligence background, none of it added up to legal evidence. In the eyes of authorities, bringing him into court would have collapsed almost immediately. And so, even as the public whispered his name, he remained a free man, part of everyday society. The years after his hospital visit only fueled the legend surrounding him. He became entangled in claims that he had Nazi connections during the Second World War. These stories grew partly from his reputation as secretive and partly from the atmosphere of paranoia in a country balanced uneasily between East and West during the Cold War. In a Finland caught in the tension of those decades, the suggestion that a foreign spy or a man with hidden wartime allegiances had murdered teenagers near a lake sounded both horrifying and believable. Whether true or not, these theories added another dimension to his story. One doctor, who had been present in the hospital later, published several books suggesting Assmann's involvement in the murders. His perspective carried weight for readers, presenting insider suspicion framed as professional witness. A former detective even went further, hinting that Assmann may have been linked to a series of unsolved crimes beyond Lake Bodom. This stretched his reputation from single suspect to figure of possible serial violence. Each accusation or theory lacked proof, yet they built on each other, creating an image of a man always lurking in the background of Finland's mysteries. By the time these views reached the public, Hans Assmann's name had taken on a new role. He was no longer simply a neighbour with a suspicious hospital visit, but a character in Finland's collective imagination. People saw him as a man with too many odd details, too many unexplained choices, too many rumours coming too close to already unsolved crimes. He became an embodiment of the unanswered. Every loose end in the investigation seemed to fold neatly into him when other suspects failed to satisfy questions. If the killer was never caught, why not believe it had been him all along? Still, the problem always came back to evidence. Despite suspicious actions and countless claims, nothing proved his involvement. No knife was ever found in his possession. No witness stood firmly to say they had seen him at the campsite. Every path back to him was indirect, resting on his haircut timing, his nervous hospital visit, and the failure of police to secure and test his clothes. This left him as a permanent suspect, someone who never became more than that. He died years later, without ever facing legal consequences for Lake Bodom, or for any of the other crimes some believed were linked to him. His passing did not end the suspicion, but instead added to the feeling that secrets had been buried with him. To the public, he represented what happens when early mistakes close doors forever, when investigators hesitate, fail to seize evidence, and allow opportunity to vanish. In the world of Finnish true crime, his name remains one of the most frequently mentioned, a puzzle piece with edges so sharp it seems it must fit, yet without the space to place it. Hans Assmann's story shows how people fill gaps left by missing answers. He had the circumstances, the timing, the behavior, and the strange attempt at changing how he looked, yet he never had the proven link investigators needed to make the case against him stand. For many, he symbolizes mystery wrapped in suspicion rather than the certainty of guilt. And in the larger narrative of the Lake Bodom murders, he serves as one of the enduring figures who kept the investigation alive in public memory without moving it forward in official files. In the end, Hans Assmann became notorious not because of what was proven about him, but because of everything that was never confirmed. His story illustrates the gap between suspicion and evidence, the void that swallowed the Lake Bodom case from its earliest days. He remains the name Finns mention when they talk about this crime, because he connects blood-stained clothes, espionage whispers, and cold investigative mistakes into one haunting image. But as much suspicion as he attracted, the case turned stranger still when attention shifted to someone less obvious, someone who at the time had not even reached adulthood. Could a 14-year-old boy really be behind Finland's most notorious unsolved murders? In the mid-1960s, years after the killings at Lake Bodom, an inmate named Pentti Soininen claimed to know the answer. While serving time in prison, he told other prisoners that he was responsible for the attack at the campsite. The claim shocked those who heard it. He provided details that made some listeners pause. His account was not a vague admission. It sounded specific enough to gain attention. For investigators already desperate to close the case, his words seemed like a potential breakthrough, even though they came from behind prison walls. At the time of the murders, in 1960, Soininen was only 14 years old. That fact alone raised immediate doubts. The victims at Lake Bodom were older than him. 2 of them were 18. So, the attacks involved both stabbing through the tent fabric and striking with a blunt weapon, actions that required force and determination. Could a teenager just entering his mid-teens manage to inflict such injuries on 4 older campers, 3 of them until death? The idea strained credibility, but the prison confession was enough to make police take a look. The story of Soininen's life added to questions rather than cleared them. He was known for violent tendencies, which gave some weight to his words. He was not a child remembered as shy or withdrawn. Instead, those who encountered him described him as volatile. This reputation meant that, when he claimed the murders as his own, some inmates and police saw it as within the realm of possibility. Given his age at the time of the killings, others argued that even with violent behavior, the stamina and physical power required for the crime were beyond him. Prison is a place where words often blur. Inmates looking for respect, power, or recognition sometimes claim roles in crimes they never committed. Studies of confession patterns inside prisons have shown that men boast falsely for attention. Others confess to crimes as a way of manipulating or distracting from their actual offences. Against that background, Soininen's admission became harder to evaluate. Was he telling the truth about something he did as a teenager? Or was this another example of a prisoner reaching for status through sensational claims? In a closed environment, even false words can spread quickly, creating lasting impressions. Those who heard his comments directly said they sounded convincing. He spoke in ways that suggested knowledge of the scene. That detail is part of why the confession did not die out quickly as a rumour. But this was years after June 1960. By that time, so much about the case had reached newspapers and public conversation. What could sound like insider knowledge might have been publicly available details twisted to appear personal. This made it difficult for police to separate what he could only know if present from what he might have absorbed secondhand. Investigators did not dismiss it outright. They explored his background, his movements, and his potential access to the lake at the time of the killings. They tried to connect him to the scene, but with no weapons found and no solid evidence linking him, the trail ended quickly. There was no physical tie between Soininen and the tent, no paper trail placing him alongside the 4 victims, and no witness who recalled him being present near the lake that night. His age only strengthened the doubts, narrowing the likelihood that he could have acted with such violence, let alone left no trace that could later be discovered. In the 1960s, separating rumour from credible testimony was already a challenge. Police did not have the investigative tools available decades later, and testimony carried more weight, but their review of Soininen's words returned nothing verifiable. With no ability to prove or fully disprove his confession, the claims slid into the category of unreliable evidence. Even so, for families and the wider public, hearing of a boy confessing to the crime years later added painful uncertainty. Was such a young teenager capable of shocking violence? Or was this another example of how badly the investigation had lost its bearings? For inmates around him, the confession may have served its purpose. Inside prison walls, talk of killing 4 teenagers could elevate someone's image as dangerous. But outside, in the realm of real investigation, it lacked the backing needed for conviction. Authorities eventually viewed his statements as boasting. Like many prison confessions, it produced attention without producing truth. Investigators concluded there was no solid evidence to support his claim. The story of Pentti Soininen's supposed involvement reflects how far leads stretched during the life of the case. Police were receptive not because they strongly believed a 14-year-old had been the killer, but because the desperation for a break was so deep. Each confession, each rumour, each whispered account became something to investigate in hopes that finally an answer would emerge. Soininen reminded those watching from afar just how fragile leads can be when no physical evidence holds them in place. His youth at the time of the murders never stopped speculation. People debated whether a young teenager could have been unusually strong or consumed by rage powerful enough to overcome the natural imbalance. Others dismissed the idea, pointing out that even adults struggle to overpower multiple people at once. 3 of the campers had boyfriends who would not have been easy to defeat, especially not by someone barely old enough to enter high school. That reality clashed with everything Soininen claimed, deepening the contradiction at the heart of his story. Later in life, Soininen's name continued to circulate in discussions of violent behavior, but it never moved beyond rumor in connection to Lake Bodom. For those who looked more closely, the prison confession fit too neatly into a pattern researchers had already identified: the tendency for young men in custody to admit to crimes they had not committed, hoping to create an aura of danger. Without any support, the claim became one more curiosity in the long timeline of the case, rather than a settled fact. This episode demonstrated how investigators, even decades after the murders, were willing to examine any lead, however unlikely. It highlighted a pattern. Each new theory, even when improbable, was pursued with the hope that it might be the one to finally explain what happened that summer morning. Soininen's story showed how easily rumor and boasting could enter the official record, leaving later generations to sort out what was serious evidence and what was not. Over time, his prison confession settled into the category of unreliable. It remains mentioned, but only as an example of how far the investigation strayed into unlikely territory as years passed with no conclusion. The most significant take from his words is not that he was ever a serious suspect, but that investigators felt pressure to chase even the most fragile possibilities. The absence of hard evidence made even implausible leads worth following, no matter how briefly. Ultimately, nothing linked Pentti Soininen to the crime beyond his own claims inside prison. For officials today, his story illustrates the limits of testimony without evidence, especially when shaped by the unique pressures and behaviors within prison life. His confession does not solve the Lake Bodom murders. Instead, it reveals how desperation for leads allowed improbable stories to survive for decades, even without merit. And while investigators eventually dismissed his words, the shift that followed took suspicion in a completely different direction. After years of pointing at outsiders, rumors, and neighborhood figures, attention turned shockingly towards someone already inside the tent that night. The only survivor left to tell the story. In late March of 2004, more than 4 decades after the morning at Lake Bodom, Finnish police made an arrest that shocked the country. Nils Gustafsson, the lone survivor of the attack, was named as the suspect. For years he had been known as the injured teenager who barely escaped with his life. Suddenly, authorities said he was the one who had killed his 3 friends on that lakeside trip. It was an announcement that reopened the wounds of the families and captured national attention. Few could imagine the case would ever circle back to the only person left alive inside that tent. The decision to arrest Gustafsson followed a review of new forensic techniques. Investigators believed that DNA analysis offered a fresh way to read the aging case files. When reviewed in 2004, the evidence was interpreted to point toward him. The Finnish National Bureau of Investigation declared that the mystery had now been solved, provided the interpretation proved correct in court. Investigators stated that blood found on certain items matched the victims, but not Gustafsson himself, which weighed heavily in their theory. This development turned what had been a cold case into an active prosecution, with Gustafsson at the center. The prosecution theory built on several pieces of physical and circumstantial evidence. They argued that Gustafsson, drunk and upset after a fight with one of the group, had been kept out of the tent. According to their view, he then turned violent. His broken jaw, rather than being the outcome of an attack against him, was presented as the result of that same fight. From there, the state said he attacked the teenagers inside the tent with a knife and a blunt object, killing them in anger. His shoes, which were discovered later some distance from the tent, became a cornerstone of this argument. They held the blood of the victims but no trace of Gustafsson's own blood. Prosecutors claimed he could have hidden items to support a story of robbery before returning to the scene to pose as a survivor. The trial began in August 2005, drawing large crowds and daily coverage in national media. People struggled with the new accusations. Many remembered him as the youth who spent weeks hospitalized. Now he was presented as a murderer who had staged injuries for sympathy. Newspapers revisited the night in full, printing diagrams of the tent, photographs of evidence, and quotes from both sides of the courtroom. The case moved from pages of forgotten files back to nightly headlines. For younger Finns, it was the first time seeing the story play out live. rather than reading about it as history. The defense countered quickly and focused on his injuries. They argued that his broken jaw, concussion, and stab wounds made it impossible for him to have carried out the murders. Medical professionals agreed that he had been assaulted with significant force. For the defense, this was proof he had been a victim, not the assailant. They insisted that outsiders had committed the killings and that Gustafsson had no physical ability to attack 3 friends in such a violent way before passing out on the tent. The lack of clear motive was another cornerstone, as no one could explain why he would kill Myla, Seppo, and Anja. Several eyewitness accounts lent some support to the defense. 2 birdwatchers reported seeing a tall, blond man at the campsite area that morning, descriptions that did not match Gustafsson's injured and bloodied state at the time. These sightings suggested another figure had been near the lake. The prosecution tried to tie those reports back to Gustafsson himself, but the court found the connection unconvincing. Other pieces of testimony, such as claims that he had once made an offhand remark or boasted about guilt to a woman years later, were also dismissed as inconclusive. None of these statements could meet the standard required for conviction. As the trial unfolded, the stakes were clear. A guilty verdict would mean a shocking rewrite of history, turning the victim into the killer. But acquittal would show just how fragile the new forensic interpretation had been. In October 2005, the verdict arrived. Nils Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. The court found that the evidence offered by the state did not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The absence of motive, the timeline of his injuries, and the lack of certainty about the facts after so many years all played into the decision. The Finnish state awarded him compensation of €44,900 for the hardship and suffering caused by his long detention during trial. It was an acknowledgement that the process had cost him emotionally and mentally. At the same time, his request to sue Finnish newspapers for defamation was rejected. The publicity surrounding his arrest and trial could not be undone, nor could the suspicion erased from public memory. Even with acquittal, he carried the shadow of the case for the rest of his life. For the public, the arrest and eventual acquittal drew attention to the fragility of old evidence. Modern methods may seem convincing, but their reliability depends on how well the original material was preserved. Here, the initial mishandling of the campsite came back into focus. Investigators had hoped DNA could close the case. Instead, the trial showed that without strong foundations, even the most advanced tools could not build certainty. The jury's decision reflected that reality. Suspicion is not proof, and after 40 years, the gap was too wide to close. The media frenzy amplified every twist. Families of victims had to watch old wounds resurfacing. Younger generations debated the case online and in forums, pulling apart the evidence themselves. International outlets covered the story, seeing it as one of Europe's most gripping cold cases. The trial, although it ended with an acquittal, kept the Lake Bodom murders alive as a subject of fascination and speculation. It reminded people of how fragile justice can be when evidence is scarce, and when decades pass before a courtroom even hears the case. By now, one thing was unavoidable to everyone watching. The early mistakes at Lake Bodom had set the crime on a trajectory toward endless doubt. Items moved without documentation, weapons never recovered, and footprints trampled all meant later generations of detectives worked from fragments. Those failures were not corrected by science in the 2000s. They created the vacuum where suspicion could briefly turn on the one survivor, only to collapse under scrutiny. The trial of Nils Gustafsson did not solve the mystery. Instead, it underscored how the choices made in the first hours after dawn in June 1960 condemned the investigation to remain incomplete. The case that was supposed to be solved ended, once again, without conviction. And in that silence, the story returned to where it began, an unsolved tragedy shaped by errors that no later generation could fix. Was the killer ever within reach, only to slip away because of failures at the very beginning? To understand why the Lake Bodom murders remain Finland's most infamous unsolved case, you have to go back to those early hours after the discovery. Police responded quickly when the bodies were found, but they failed to secure the site. Instead of restricting access, officers, soldiers, reporters, and nearby civilians stepped onto the ground, brushing past the tent and handling belongings. What should have been an untouched window into the crime became a scene clouded with interference, where original details mixed with new ones. The first 24 hours are vital in almost any investigation. Precise photographs, careful logging of items, and the preservation of footprints can provide a timeline that becomes the backbone of a case. At Lake Bodom, those hours ended up doing the opposite. Items were shifted, the tent was manipulated, and soldiers searching for clues walked across grass where the attacker might have fled. Even the victims' exact positions were lost, leaving investigators unsure of how events unfolded inside or outside the tent. That destruction of order meant the chance to create a clear record was erased before it even really began. One area of particular damage involved the footprints and ground impressions. At a lakeside campsite, soil and grass can hold remarkable amounts of information about who entered and exited. That morning, dozens of feet trampled across the same patches, blending any trail left by the attacker with the steps of those trying to solve the case. Reports later stressed how vital those footprints would have been. Perhaps they showed how many people had moved around or what direction they had taken. With the ground disturbed, investigators could not even say whether there was one killer or possibly two. The missing weapons created another permanent gap. Police knew from autopsy results that both a knife and a blunt instrument had been used. Yet those tools of violence never appeared. Soldiers waded through water, combed the surrounding woods, and scoured the area, but no weapon was recovered. The result was devastating. If the knife or blunt object had been taken into evidence, fingerprints might have been lifted. Later on, DNA analysis could have been performed. In the absence of these tools, all theories remained speculation. Rumors about suspects never had the anchor of a physical instrument to tie them to the crime. When modern forensic methods became available decades later, investigators realized how much had been lost. DNA has solved countless cases worldwide, but it requires preserved samples. At Lake Bodom, the chain of custody was broken almost at the start. Clothes had been handled without gloves, blood had been trampled into soil, and nothing from the campsite existed in the same condition as originally found. By the time laboratories tried to extract material evidence in the 2000s, it was simply too degraded or too contaminated to be trusted. Technology had advanced, but its usefulness was bound to decisions made back in 1960. This failure did not just block scientific progress. It also fueled endless suspicion. Because no suspect could ever be linked through physical evidence, every new theory had room to grow unchecked. Locals pointed to Carl Valdemar Gillström, others suspected Hans Assmann, and still others followed later prison confessions or even suggestions that Nils Gustafsson himself had been guilty. In each of these situations, prosecutors lacked what courts require: solid proof tied to the scene. All they had were accounts coloured by rumour and time. With strong evidence, names could have been cleared or charges brought. Without it, suspicion simply rotated from one person to the next. For families of the victims, that rotation meant living in uncertainty. Parents never truly knew who had killed their children. Brothers and sisters heard theories rise and fall through the decades, each one leaving scars of renewed grief. For Nils Gustafsson, it meant something worse. As the survivor, public suspicion often turned on him in the absence of clear proof, pointing elsewhere. That burden culminated in his arrest and trial in 2004. Although he was eventually acquitted, the fact that investigators were able to charge him decades later demonstrates how the evidence void left room for almost any narrative to be tried, tested, and eventually dismissed. Experts in criminology have often said that the Lake Bodom case offered a classic example of how fragile an investigation can be. Preserving integrity of the scene is the first and most basic step, yet it never happened here. Once that barrier broke, the rest of the case followed in its shadow. Contamination blurred timelines, weapon searches turned nothing, and victims' belongings lost context. Even with helicopters, sonar, and forensic breakthroughs in later years, none of it mattered when the foundation was unstable. The beginning shaped the end. This raises the question: was the killer ever actually close to being identified? Some believe yes. If footprints had been preserved, if weapons had been logged, if victims' positions had been documented carefully, the crime could have been reconstructed. With modern databases and DNA testing, cross-references might have exposed a suspect even years later. Others argue the killer was always beyond reach. Without eyewitnesses and without motive, perhaps the case was doomed from the moment dawn broke over the lake. Most agree, however, that the slippage of vital evidence meant an already difficult case became nearly impossible. The cost was not measured only in investigative records. It carried human weight. Families questioned why procedures had been ignored. Survivors bore suspicion they could not shed. Police themselves admitted regret, stating that the handling of the scene may have doomed the investigation for good. That admission lingers in official accounts, a rare moment where investigators acknowledge that their own actions may have been as damaging as the crime itself. For a country shocked by the violence of 3 teenage deaths, the secondary shock was realizing that the possibility of justice had been squandered right away. By now, the case has become a national tragedy, remembered less for what was proven and more for what was lost. When Finns talk about Lake Bodom, They do not only remember the brutality of the attack, they remember the confusion of the scene afterward, the missing weapons, the contaminated evidence, and the decades of speculation that filled the gaps. The unsolved status is directly tied to those first hours. Without them, there may well have been closure. With them, the events froze into permanent uncertainty. The Lake Bodom murders stand as a warning about the high stakes of crime scene management. What was destroyed in 1960 could never be rebuilt. The case endures not just because of the violence carried out, but because the story of failure added another wound. It became a haunting reminder that early errors set the trajectory, and in this case, that trajectory was endless silence. And though culture found ways to transform the story into songs, films, and folklore, the actual answers never followed. The roots of that mystery stay planted in the first 24 hours, the time that should have preserved the truth but instead ensured it was gone. The murders at Lake Bodom did not fade quietly into history. Instead, they grew into something larger than the crime itself. Over time, the story became part of Finland's cultural identity, retold in homes, echoed around campfires, and shared by people who often had no direct connection to the lake. The fact that it was never solved gave it a kind of life that official closure might have ended. Each generation found its own way to carry the case forward, changing it from a tragedy rooted in 1960 into a symbol that continues to move through music, film, and conversation. One of the most direct examples of this transformation came from cinema. In 2016, a Finnish horror thriller film, simply titled Bodom, took its inspiration from the murders. The film followed 4 modern-day teenagers who travel to the site of the killings with the hope of piecing together the mystery. What began as a reconstruction, meant to explore a decades-old crime, shifts into a fictional story of its own, blending the real event with creative license. That project showed just how much the murders had seeped into cultural imagination. For Finnish audiences, the film was more than just another slasher story. It was a reflection of an incident that had haunted their parents and grandparents. Music also carried the memory of Lake Bodom into new spaces. The melodic death metal band Children of Bodom took their name directly from the killings. For years, the band toured internationally, performing to audiences who may have never heard of the case otherwise. The link between the band's name and the tragedy ensured the murders remained spoken of far beyond Finland. Fans who wondered about the unusual name often stumbled into the story, learning about the murders through curiosity about the music. In this way, the band created a lasting connection between Finnish culture, art, and the unresolved violence at the lake. Podcast 2 gave the case renewed attention across borders. Shows like Case File, True Crime, Red-Handed, Morbid, and Heart Starts Pounding brought global audiences into the details of the crime. Episodes retold the morning of June 1960, the failures of the police, and the swirl of suspects. Each show added its own approach, but the simple act of retelling pulled Lake Bodom into new ears around the world. For some listeners, it was their introduction to Finland's most famous unsolved case. The inclusion of the story on large platforms shows how the reach of true crime has turned local tragedies into shared international subjects. The story also found a place in online forums where people debated suspects, shared theories, and compared clues. Message boards and comment sections filled with speculation about motives, confessions, and the impact of the investigation's mistakes. For many of these strangers separated by geography, Finland's quiet woodland lake became a stage for endless curiosity. In these digital spaces, the line between fact, rumor, and imagination often blurred. Conspiracy theories linking the murders to espionage networks or secret cover-ups were common. They highlight how mystery tends to create gaps that people rush to fill. Where evidence is missing, imagination steps in. For younger audiences, especially those born long after 1960, Lake Bodom has taken on the tone of folklore as much as crime history. Stories circulate at bonfires or lakeside gatherings the same way ghost tales do. Teenagers trading whispers about the case imagine the tent by the water, the unseen killer outside, and the unanswered questions. The murders have become a cautionary tale in those settings, not a list of legal details, but a warning about vulnerability in what should feel like safe places. In this way, the victims are remembered indirectly, and the lack of closure makes the case easier to retell as story rather than trial record. This cultural retelling has two sides. On one side, it helps keep the memory of the crime alive. People who might never look at old police documents or archived newspaper clippings still know the outlines through music, lyrics, film scenes, and podcast episodes. On the other side, the constant retelling can shift the murders away from their human tragedy into myth. Details get altered to fit narratives or dramatizations. Characters like Hans Assmann or Carl Gillström move from suspects into folk villains. The reality that 3 teenagers lost their lives at Lake Bodom often gets overshadowed by the strange allure of the enduring mystery. That process of myth-making is common with unsolved cases. They become mirrors for culture itself. Each retelling says as much about the people telling the story as about the crime. In Finland, Bodom's history shows how a single incident from the 1960s can echo through heavy metal music, independent film, and late-night podcasts, listened to by an entire new generation abroad. The crime does not stay fixed in time. It shifts as culture shifts, taking on forms that fit each era's way of processing fear and fascination. International coverage contributes to this transformation as well. News outlets outside Finland often refer to Bodom as one of Europe's most chilling mysteries. These articles present it alongside other legendary unsolved cases, ensuring it stays relevant in a broader narrative of unexplained violence. The name Lake Bodom itself has become shorthand for mystery. Mentioned in headlines, it needs little explanation for readers familiar with true crime. Over the decades, what was once the name of a quiet Finnish lake has become a cultural symbol standing for something darker. Because the case is unsolved, it gives people freedom to imagine outcomes. Some storytellers focus on the idea of a lone stranger who attacked the camp and vanished. Others play up theories of personal betrayal, espionage, or even supernatural intervention. While those ideas diverge from facts, they all share the same core: a fascination with the unknown. Unlike closed cases, where motive and suspect are set, unsolved murders allow creativity to fill the void. That freedom ensures Bodom continues to regenerate across platforms, appearing in new media forms decades after the night itself. The podcasts, films, and band names did not create the fascination. They preserved and expanded it. The roots were already in the community, where people told the story each summer. Campers who set up near the lake often repeated the story of what had happened there, treating it with the same weight as ghost stories. Parents reminded children to be cautious at night, their warnings carrying the undertone of the unsolved murders. Over years, the oral sharing of the case cemented the murders as something larger than one incident at one time. By now, the crime is remembered less through evidence and more through narrative. It is not just Finland's most famous unsolved case, it is also a lens into how people keep mysteries alive when the truth is out of reach. Lake Bodom has become part of culture itself, where art and memory intersect. When a metal band names itself after the lake, or a filmmaker builds a whole story around it, they are not just retelling, they are ensuring that the unanswered crime never slips away entirely. The Lake Bodom murders linger in collective memory because of their unsolved nature, and because early failures left a permanent hole where answers should be. In that absence, storytelling took root. The case turned from tragedy into legend, from evidence into myth. Finland's most notorious unsolved crime has, in effect, become a reflection of its own culture, showing how people process violence, mystery, and loss. Which leaves only one lingering question: was the case ever truly solvable in the first place? The Lake Bodom murders are remembered not only for their brutality but also for the mistakes that followed. The failure to secure the crime scene and preserve the evidence meant investigators lost their best chance at the truth in the first hours. What if those steps had been done correctly? Would the murder weapons have been found or a suspect identified? Instead, the scene was contaminated, timelines erased, and leads discarded. What remains is silence, where answers should be. The case endures because the truth was lost in time, and that silence may never be broken.